Oh man, there were a lot of bad words in that video. I hope your mom was sitting there right next to you watching this with you. Uh, so, where we want to kind of follow this up with is there are a couple new environmental principles, and I have the question mark there because I don't want you to assume that these are hard and fast common rules like that strict liability idea or the principle of state responsibility. We have trickier problems like climate change and genetically modified foods and cloning and all this kind of stuff. Can we come up with some other principles that will help solve these things? And here are a couple that have emerged from like the Kyoto Protocol. The Paris Agreement tweaks these a little bit, but are these going to be new rules that the roommates that are the states of the world, are these going to be helpful in solving some of these problems? So we're just going to look at two new environmental principles, say, are these new common rules that are coming in, do they work? They also help explain why the United States is not that on board. I should say the United States, not all of the United States, but like Trump and honestly, the U.S. economy, businesses, they're not really on board with this Paris Peace Agreement. I get we don't want the world to collapse. At the same time, how much should the U.S. bear responsibility for that? So these two principles help explain a little bit about why the U.S. is not quite on board. So the first one is the principle that developed countries have to clean up first. The story goes that essentially the wealth that these developed countries have, like the United States, England, Europe, things like that, they were able to be developed today because they spent the last 150, 200 years really abusing the environment. The Industrial Revolution and all that, just kicking all sorts of greenhouse gases in the atmosphere. And so if we look at, for example, so here's two ways of looking at it. Here's way number one. Way number one is, let's look around the world in 2020 and see how much greenhouse gases everyone's putting out. So the U.S. is putting out, let's say, 100, whatever that is. China's putting out 100, whatever that is. And so by this sort of calculation, both the U.S. and China should reduce by the same amount. Okay, that's possibility number one. The second proposal, which is this proposal here, says, okay, let's count all the greenhouse gas, let's count all the molecules. I know this is exactly what they're saying. Count all the molecules in the atmosphere right now. Those have been put in there from 1800 to 2020. So if we count all the ones that are up there, the U.S. has, let's say, 100. But China, because it's a relatively new carbon emitter, maybe only has 20. It still has a lot from the recent days, but from 1800 to 1970, it had almost nothing. And so if we do it that way, then the United States has done more of the damage than China, so the United States should reduce more than China should. It should clean up first. So those are the two principles there. Now, it's not that difficult to see that the United States, in general, likes this proposal. And China and a lot of other states, developing states, like this proposal. And that's one of the big distinctions there. So these states here, because they put all that stuff in the atmosphere already and they've already benefited from it, they should have higher restrictions than the newer emitters. The problem, of course, is that developed states like the United States, they just don't agree with that. It's been called environmental affirmative action. And the U.S. refused to sign the Kyoto Protocol as a result of this. It's one of the reasons that Trump states about not wanting to be part of the Paris Agreement, even though this is not as strong in the Paris Agreement. But that principle is sort of sitting out there, and he doesn't want to give it any sort of leverage. Rich states have the power to resist this principle. Like in the United States, if the United States wants to pull out of the agreement, that it's not like, if Bangladesh pulls out of the agreement, everybody says, oh, that's a bummer. But Bangladesh is a very small part of what's going on in the world in terms of greenhouse gases. The United States has the power to resist this principle. Like, what are you going to do? You going to put economic sanctions on the United States? Probably not. And so That's part of the issue. So that's one new principle that obviously the United States in general tends to resist. Um, Europe's a tougher one on this. Europe does tend to resist this, but they're a little more okay with it. But there are pockets in Europe that are not as big a fan. U.S. is really the thing that does not like this principle. The second principle is the precautionary principle. And it goes like this. Here's the principle. When an environmental threat exists. So we don't, the bad stuff hasn't happened yet. Like you can look out there and say, oh, climate change is causing bad stuff, but not like the catastrophic stuff. When an environmental threat exists and there's uncertainty about the science, like we're not sure if this causes that or that causes that. So there might be people who say greenhouse gas emissions are going to lead, and climate change is going to lead to catastrophe. And others that say, well, it's going to lead to a little bit of changes, but we're not sure how big a change. And other people that say, no, it's not going to at all. And based on the science of the whole thing. So we're not really sure what's going to happen. What the precautionary principle says is you err on the side of reducing the threat. Until you know for sure what's going to happen, don't let the possibility of a catastrophe happen. That's the idea here. Another example, well, I'll give you some implications. Implications for global warming, obviously. Here's one for genetically modified foods, that we're not sure exactly what genetically modified foods are going to, if you have more of these, what harm that's going to do to agriculture out there. Is it going to sort of drive other kinds of seeds out of production? We're not sure what it's going to do to human physiology or animal physiology, et cetera, et cetera. So until we know for sure, we have some scientific certainty on this, we should not use genetically modified foods. That's the precautionary principle. Another one would be nuclear weapons and technology. We don't know exactly how this was the conversation that was happening back in the 1945. We're not exactly sure what's going to happen with if we start launching nuclear weapons all over the place. So let's back off the technology. Obviously, the precautionary principle did not happen in that case. But here's the problem, though. The problem is that this gives the international community lots of say over domestic economic development. It's essentially saying, I know you're this food company, you want to do this, but you shouldn't do it because the international community says we're not sure yet. And if there's one thing the United States and a lot of countries don't like, is anybody telling them what to do with their domestic economic development. And again, you heard that in some of the complaints that Trump has about the Paris Agreement. It's not that we're held to what the Paris Agreement says, but it definitely does create this idea that if the United States moves ahead with some things it thinks is important for its economy, the international community can sort of shame it and cause some other problems like that. All right, so that is this. Like I said, collective action problems are going to come up all over the place. Those of you who are really concerned about environmental issues, they're super solvable. We just have to crack this code that we talked about today. It's not simple, but there are ways to do it. And so don't give up and think about here's a way to think about how to solve those problems. So you have an assignment that you're going to do. It's the next page on this, and you're going to do an assignment on the Paris Climate Agreement. And I want you to talk about whether you think it was a good idea for the United States for Donald Trump, the United States, to back out of the Paris Agreement, or do you think we should get back into the Paris Agreement? I'm not making this discussion because that can get messy. Just tell me what you think and why. Support that with using the language of this, of what we talked about today with collective action problems, etc. Okay, see you guys.